So the risk identification is really important because this would lead to the number of controls that you are trying to implement, right? And this would also lead to your risk identification, not only from a cyber perspective, but from a legal and regulatory perspective as well, right? So from a risk identification perspective, the first and very most important step is to identify the relevant assets and their valuation, right? Because if you don't know what you're trying to protect, you're really not protecting each and everything within the organization. And when I say assets, it's everything. It's your technical, it's your technology, it's your hardware. When I say technology, it's really your tools and technologies, right? It's your hardware, it's your paper-based assets, it's all your people, which are really important. So remember, anything happens to the firm, people are the first priority. They need to be protected first, and everything comes second. No matter what the situation is, people comes first always, right? So really, the underlying idea is, from a risk identification perspective, to understand that what sort of assets do we have, right? What are we trying to protect in the first place? Because if we don't know what we are trying to protect, then how are we going to assess the risk? How are we going to implement, making sure that the implementation of those controls are uniform across the organization, right? So so when you mentioned, I think, Alan, when you mentioned that we have identified the risk of phishing, right? So instead of that, you could really have the list of assets with you, right? Saying that, we have got N number of servers, we have got X number of endpoints with us, and we have got N number of users, right? And should a phishing attempt happens, this is my risk exposure, right? So say that if you have 500 users within your firm, right, or 500 workstations, let's just say 500 users within the firm, right? And now we know that what we are trying to protect, right? Along with the workstations, servers, and pretty much everything, whatever we have. One of the risks that we have identified is phishing, right? Now, what if you don't have the adequate control, right? If you don't have the adequate control, my risk exposure my risk exposure is really all the 500 users right now, right? Isn't it? So to make sure that we are, concluding that what is my risk exposure, and when I say risk exposure, it's not just limited to 500 users. It's the data that they are holding, right? It's the data that they're holding, and what would be my overall impact. And these parameters, or these metrics, or these the risk indicators, so you would only be able to talk through these risk indicators only when you know what you are trying to protect, and that means understanding your assets, which is really important. I know that's a long way to say, but I hope that that makes sense to you. So what, at least in my experience, the more matured organizations, they are going for the quantification of all the risk, because they have the capability and they have the capacity to do that. They have a separate team within the risk itself, within the line to itself, to quantify each of those and talk to the business owners, and they have got enough capacity in those terms. So obviously, the more mature organizations are going for the quantification, largely the quantification of all the risk. But when we speak about the small and the medium-sized businesses, I would say it's a split of qualitative, and qualitative and quantitative. So some of the small organizations, definitely they would not go ahead with the quantitative risk approach, because it's really exhaustive. I mean, as easy as it may sound, it's really difficult to apply in the real time, in a real life scenario. So they would typically go for qualitative, because they have got experienced professionals from some of the larger firms within their firm, and they would typically go for the qualitative. The another approach, which I already touched upon briefly, is the hybrid approach, wherein they are identifying all the critical assets. They are identifying all the critical assets, quantifying those, and for others, they would go for the qualitative ones. So that's a hybrid approach that they would be taking, and also documented in the risk management framework, the overall risk management framework that they would be adopting. So yeah, you would not be able to compute the exact loss, but you would be able to compute the potential impact exposure, right? Impact exposure based on based on historical trends. And this is some, and that's why I mentioned that it's really difficult for a company to quantify each and everything. And that's some of the reasons why, most of the organizations would go for the hybrid approach. But definitely from an impact perspective, you could still go for the exposure. I mean, the impact exposure that they may have if the business goes down for, say, for 3 minutes, for 5 minutes, and that would also be relating to your business impact analysis on the e-commerce portal as a whole, right? So based on the historical data that you may have, say that from the last 1 year, I'm just taking random assumptions here, right? So say from the last 1 year, if you see that every 3 minutes you have n number of items added to the cart and a number of items being checked out, and this is the average order value and sort of stuff, that would still there would still be a possibility to at least determine the impact exposure, and that doesn't have to be perfect. That doesn't really have to be perfect. It's just that we are trying to get an idea, and we are trying to get a range of the impact that we are anticipating. It may be less, it may be more, it really could be anything. But from a quantitative perspective, you could adopt to some of those tailored methodologies, if you will. So I undertook a similar assignment wherein the company integrated Swift for its payment portal, right? And I mean for its payment terms with the clients, and they had their own payment portal, and what I mean they had their own portal to conclude the payment. However, they were using Swift, right? In this case, really the risk of any payment fraud, or I mean payment fraud, when I say payment fraud, it's related only to Swift, or it could, in your case, any XYZ portal, would really lie with this particular vendor, right? And obviously you'll have controls like third party control assurance and whatnot and sort of stuff to make sure that they are compliant with each and everything, and should any incident happen, they would notify you in a timely manner, sort of stuff, right? But even then, an incident could really happen, right? So the likelihood of this happening, wherein the payment portal itself, Swift or any other payment portal that you are adopting to, goes down, the likelihood of that would really be dependent on the risk assessment that they have conducted. And you would really need to understand that what their BIA says, right? And this is something that they would be more than happy to share with you as well, because they know that you are really dependent on them for some of those stuffs. And if it goes down, then you would have a bigger impact from that perspective, right? But what I have seen in my experience, the likelihood, I mean, the impact would be really high. That's non-negotiable, right? The impact could be high or catastrophic based on the volume of transactions that it may happen. But the likelihood either could be low, or it could be rare, depending on the history of their portal going down, or them being compromised. And this is something that you'll have to speak to them and understand that historically what are the incidents that occurred within their environment, and what sort of BIA that they are looking at in terms of RTO and RPO. And that's when you would be concluding on the likelihood piece of it. However, the impact would still be high if you're really dependent on them and they are a critical vendor for you. That if they goes down, then definitely you are getting impacted from a volume of transactions, sort of stuff. So this is how we would be looking at from a likelihood perspective.